Jordan stood frozen in the center of a high-tech rental property, his knuckles bleeding and his breath hitching as he watched his own life incinerate on a wall of monitors. On the main screen, his daughter Chloe stood on the edge of a rain-slicked bridge, her eyes hollowed out by a voice that sounded exactly like his own, whispering that he had never loved her. Below the video, a countdown timer pulsed in a rhythmic, digital red. 6 minutes until his private therapy notes and every intimate detail of his late wife's death were broadcast to the entire city. He lunged for the server rack, but the keyboard was dead, the mouse unresponsive, and the heavy steel door behind him hissed as the electronic lock slammed into place. "I'm sorry, Jordan." A familiar voice crackled through the room's hidden speakers, distorted by a layer of static and spite. "But you were always the one who taught me that secrets are just lies, waiting to be caught." Jordan didn't recognize the voice, but he recognized the password flashing on the screen. A string of numbers from a childhood home he thought had been forgotten 20 years ago. As the timer hit 5 minutes, the screen shifted to a live stream of a van parked directly outside his own house, and a shadow moved behind the steering wheel. Jordan realized with a jolt of pure terror that he wasn't just being hacked. He was being buried alive by someone who knew exactly where the shovel was hidden. The screen burned, not with light, with something sharper, something that clawed at the back of Jordan's throat. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, knuckles white as bone, while the forum thread pulsed in the dim glow of his monitor. Someone had dug up the photo, the one from the hospital, Sarah's last smile, the one he'd kept locked in a private folder, encrypted, buried. Now it sat there, pixelated and cruel, beneath a string of comments that slithered like maggots. "Lol, who even takes pics like this? Creepy AF," one user wrote. Another added, "Bet she died laughing at his face." The words didn't just sit on the screen, they vibrated, each letter a needle pricking his skin. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, the kind that left his lungs raw. The office smelled of stale coffee and the metallic tang of his own sweat, the air conditioner humming a low, indifferent drone. He should have turned it off. Should have done a lot of things. This was a digital assassination, a systematic dismantling of his mourning process, and the realization that he was being targeted sent a cold shiver down his spine. The photo wasn't just a leak. It was a declaration of war. Jordan's hand shot out, fingers slamming the power button. The screen died with a quiet click, but the image stayed seared behind his eyelids. He exhaled through his nose, sharp and controlled, like he was trying to blow out a candle that wouldn't go out. The chair creaked as he leaned back, the plastic digging into his spine. He didn't have time for the luxury of a breakdown. He stood, his movements jerky, and crossed to the server rack in the corner. The hum of the machines was steady, a mechanical heartbeat. He crouched, fingers flying over the keyboard mounted on the rack. "Emergency lockdown. Now," he muttered, his voice a low grind. He wasn't just a counselor. He was a man who understood the architecture of the web. He began the grueling process of isolating local drives, severing the umbilical cord to the internet. The system responded with a series of beeps, sharp and efficient. He watched the status bars crawl, his eyes reflecting the flickering LED lights of the router. Every second the network remained open was another second the intruder could reach into his life and pull out a piece of his soul. He worked with a frantic precision, his mind racing through the possibilities of how they'd gotten in. This wasn't a script kiddie. This was someone who knew where the bones were buried. The silence of the house was suddenly broken by a soft, muffled sob from the living room. Jordan froze, his fingers hovering over the enter key. He rose from the server rack, his joints popping, and moved toward the doorway. Chloe was huddled on the brown leather couch, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of her tablet. She was staring at the same forum thread, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The vanilla scent of her body spray felt cloying in the heavy air. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are they saying these things? Why would they have Mom's picture?" Jordan crossed the room in 3 long strides, sinking onto the cushions beside her. He pulled her into his side, feeling the frantic tremor in her shoulders. She felt like a bird with a broken wing, fragile and terrified. "I don't know, honey," he said, his voice dropping into that low rasp he used when the world was falling apart. "But I'm going to stop it. I promise you. I'm going to lock everything down. They won't get anything else." He could feel the weight of his lie. He didn't know if he could stop it, but he had to be the anchor. Chloe's grief was a raw, open wound, and this digital cruelty was salt being poured directly into it. A heavy thud echoed from the front porch, followed by the sound of boots on wet wood. Jordan tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy glass paperweight on the end table. But a familiar voice called out through the door. "Jordan, it's Leo. Open up." Jordan exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and stood to unbolt the door. Leo Carter stepped inside, shaking a damp leather jacket. He looked like he'd been living 3 lives at once, his green eyes scanning the room with a hunter's intensity. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I saw the thread," Leo said, his voice a slow drawl. He held up a ruggedized laptop. "I've got a decrypted server log from the forum's back end. We need to move." They migrated to the kitchen, the smell of coffee and rain clinging to Leo. He set the laptop on the Formica counter, the screen filled with cascading lines of green code. "This isn't just a random hit, Jordan. The data suggests an internal vulnerability. Someone didn't just hack you. They walked through a door that was already unlocked." Jordan leaned over the counter, his eyes tracking the IP addresses. The realization was a physical blow to the stomach. The attack was sophisticated, layered with proxies, but the entry point was local. They moved back into the home office, the twin monitors casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. The air was stuffy, smelling of ozone and the stale heat of the PC tower. Leo took the main chair, his fingers dancing across the mechanical keyboard with a speed that made Jordan's head swim. "I'm trying to peel back the proxy layers," Leo muttered, his jaw clenched. "But they're hopping every 30 seconds. It's like chasing a ghost in a hall of mirrors." Jordan stood behind him, his hands buried in the pockets of his frayed navy sweater. He watched the notifications ping on his secondary screen. More comments, more shares. The photo of Sarah spreading like a virus. Every ping felt like a heartbeat, loud and insistent in the cramped room. "They're laughing, Leo," Jordan said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're turning her death into a meme." The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. They were losing ground, the intruder always one step ahead, dancing through the firewalls Jordan had spent years building. A sharp, metallic click echoed from the corner of the room, the sound of a screwdriver meeting a casing. Jordan spun around, his eyes narrowing in the dim light. Behind the secondary server rack, a shadow moved. A figure in a dark hoodie and a featureless mask was crouched by the floor outlet, a small black device in his hand. A hardware keylogger. The intruder wasn't just in the wires, he was in the room. The air in the office suddenly felt like lead. Jordan didn't think. He reacted. The man in the mask looked up, his eyes cold and flat like a shark's through the eye holes. He scrambled to his feet, trying to shove the device into a pocket. But Jordan was already moving. This was the violation made flesh. the ghost in the machine given a body he could actually hit. The sanctuary of his home, the place where he'd tried to raise Chloe in the wreckage of their lives, had been breached by a physical presence. The intruder lunged for the door, but Jordan cut him off, his shoulders slamming into the man's chest with a grunt of pure, unadulterated rage. They collided with the force of 2 freight trains. Jordan's fingers clawed at the man's hoodie, trying to get a grip, but the fabric was slick, synthetic. They spun into the hallway, a chaotic blur of limbs and a heavy breathing. The intruder swung a wild, heavy fist that grazed Jordan's temple, sending a spark of white light through his vision. Jordan didn't falter. He drove his knee into the man's midsection, feeling the air leave the intruder's lungs in a wet wheeze. They crashed into the living room, the momentum carrying them straight into the glass coffee table. The sound of the shattering pane was like a gunshot in the quiet house. Shards of glass flew, biting into Jordan's forearms, but he didn't let go. He had the man pinned for a second, his hands reaching for the mask, desperate to see the face of the monster. The intruder was strong, moving with a desperate, calculated force that suggested training. He shoved a heavy boot into Jordan's chest, launching him backward onto the rug. Jordan scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the man was already sprinting for the front door. Jordan burst through the doorway, the cold Spokane air hitting him like a physical blow. The fog was a thick, gray soup, swallowing the street lamps and turning the neighborhood into a graveyard of shifting shadows. "Stop!" Jordan bellowed, his voice echoing off the neighboring houses. But the figure was already a fading silhouette. He ran to the edge of the lawn, his lungs burning, his eyes straining against the gloom. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the drip of moisture from the maple tree in the yard. He stood there for a long time, his hands shaking, the blood from the glass cuts warm on his skin. He'd failed. The man was gone, disappearing into the mist like he'd never been there at all. The frustration was a bitter taste in his mouth, a mixture of bile and adrenaline. He felt exposed, a target painted on his back in neon colors. The fog didn't just hide the intruder. It felt like it was closing in on Jordan, isolating him from the world he thought he knew. He turned to head back inside, his boots crunching on the gravel of the driveway, when something caught the light. A small rectangular object lay near the edge of the concrete, half hidden by a tuft of grass. He knelt, his fingers brushing against cold plastic. It was a smartphone, the screen cracked but still glowing with a faint, dying light. The intruder must have dropped it during the scuffle. Jordan picked it up, his thumb tracing the jagged lines on the glass. This was it. A physical link. He didn't wait. He hurried back into the house, slamming the door and bolting it with trembling hands. Leo was standing in the hallway, his green eyes wide as he took in Jordan's blood-streaked arms. "You okay?" Leo asked, his voice tight. Jordan didn't answer. He just held up the phone. "He dropped this. Tell me you can get into it." They retreated to the office, the shattered glass in the living room, a grim reminder of how close the threat had come. The phone was a lifeline, a way to turn the tide of a war that had felt entirely one-sided until this moment. Leo didn't waste a second. He plugged the cracked device into a forensic bridge, his eyes fixed on the progress bars that began to crawl across his monitor. "It's encrypted, but the OS is old," Leo muttered, his knuckles cracking as he worked. Jordan paced in tight, counterclockwise circles, his fingers digging into his palms. The air in the room felt electric. "I've got the GPS cache," Leo said suddenly, his voice sharp. He pulled up a map of Spokane, a series of red dots appearing across the screen. "He's been moving between a few locations, But there's a recurring hit here. He pointed to a suburban area on the outskirts of the city. A rental property. He's been there every night for the last week. Jordan leaned in, his eyes narrowing at the address. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people went to be forgotten. The red dot felt like a bullseye. "That's him," Jordan said, his voice a low grind. "That's where he's running the show." The shift from victim to hunter was instantaneous, a cold clarity settling over him that pushed the fear to the periphery. But Leo wasn't finished. He tapped a few more keys, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Jordan, I'm looking at the authorization logs for the mirroring script, the one that's letting him see your screens." He paused, his gaze shifting to Jordan, filled with a look that made Jordan's blood run cold. This wasn't a bypass. The device that's mirroring your data, it's an old administrative account, one you authorized personally about 5 years ago. Jordan felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I haven't authorized anything like that in a decade." He pushed Leo aside and stared at the lines of code. The username was a string of characters he recognized instantly. A private joke, a sequence he'd used for a family cloud account he'd shared with his brother, Marcus, before the drugs and the rage had torn them apart. The realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. This wasn't a stranger. This was blood. The nightmare wasn't coming from the outside. It was a ghost from his own past, using the trust he'd discarded years ago to dismantle his life. The house went very, very still. Jordan stood in the center of the office, the blue light of the monitors making his skin look like marble. He could hear the low hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a floorboard upstairs where Chloe was hopefully sleeping, and the frantic thud of his own heart. The betrayal was a physical weight, a pressure in his lungs that made it hard to breathe. He looked at his hands, scarred from the glass, shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and white-hot fury. He wasn't just fighting for a reputation or a career anymore. He was fighting for his daughter's sanity, for the memory of a woman who couldn't defend herself, and against a man who knew exactly where to strike to cause the most pain. "Leo," Jordan said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet tone that signaled the end of his patience. "We're not just tracing him anymore. We're going to end this." He knew the cost would be high. He knew his career was already on the chopping block, but as he looked at the photo of Chloe on his desk, he realized he didn't have a choice. The next morning, the world didn't slow down to accommodate his crisis. Jordan's tablet chimed on the kitchen counter, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the fog of his 3-hour sleep. It was an email from the school district's legal department. "Emergency hearing. Professional conduct and financial discrepancies. 10:00 a.m. He stared at the words, the steam from his coffee rising in a thin, mocking trail. Marcus wasn't just going after his heart. He was going after his hands, the tools he used to provide for Chloe. He looked at the clock. It was already 8:30. He hadn't even had time to process the betrayal of the night before, and now he was being summoned to a guillotine. He walked to the hallway, looking at Chloe's closed door. He wanted to go in, to hold her, to explain that the voice she might hear on the internet wasn't him, but he knew the words would just sound like another lie. He had to win first. He had to clear the field before he could bring her back to safety. The school board hearing room was a beige vacuum, a place where empathy went to die under fluorescent lights. Jordan sat at a small side table, his laptop closed like a shield in front of him. Across the long, polished oak table sat the board members, 5 people who had known him for years. now looking at him like he was a specimen under a microscope. The chairperson, a woman with iron-gray hair and a voice like dry parchment, clicked a remote. A projector flared to life, casting a series of bank statements against the wall. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her eyes cold. "These were sent to the district's tip line this morning. They appear to show a series of unauthorized transfers from the Student Activity Fund into a private offshore account. Your private account." Jordan stared at the numbers. They were perfect. The dates, the amounts, the digital signatures. It was a masterpiece of forgery. "I didn't do this," he said, his voice a low grind. "My system was breached. I reported it last night." The chairperson didn't even blink. "The metadata suggests these files were created on your home computer, Jordan, over a period of 6 months." The weight of the ultimatum was delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You have exactly 6 hours," the chairperson said, leaning forward. 6 hours to provide forensic proof that these are forgeries, or we will be forced to revoke your counseling license and turn this over to the police." Jordan stood, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. The room felt like it was shrinking, the beige walls closing in. He looked at the board members, searching for a single flicker of doubt, a single person who remembered the man he was. He found nothing but professional distance. He turned and walked out, his boots echoing in the hollow hallway. 6 hours. It was a death sentence. Marcus had timed it perfectly, a pincer movement designed to crush him between the loss of his daughter and the loss of his livelihood. He reached his car in the parking lot, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. As he reached for the door handle, the car's alarm exploded into life. The shrill, repetitive wail bounced off the brick walls of the administrative building, drawing the eyes of every passerby. Jordan jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He hit the unlock button on his fob, and the sound died, only to roar back to life 3 seconds later. He stood there, the center of an unwanted spectacle, frantically mashing the buttons. It was a petty, psychological jab, a reminder that Marcus was always watching, always able to reach out and touch him. "Shut up," Jordan hissed, his thumb white-knuckled against the plastic. Onlookers paused on the sidewalk, their faces a mix of annoyance and suspicion. To them, he was just a man losing control of his machine. To Jordan, it was the sound of his sanity fraying. He finally managed to kill the alarm by disconnecting the battery, his hands covered in grease and frustration. Marcus wanted him tired. He wanted him rattled. And God help him, it was working. Back in the home office, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and desperation. Leo was hunched over the monitors, his face pale in the blue glow. "He's widened the perimeter," Leo said, not looking up. "I tried to run a trace on the forgery source, but he's got a dead man's switch on the connection. Every time I get close, the IP dissolves." Jordan sat in the secondary chair, his head in his hands. He felt like he was playing chess against a grandmaster who could see 3 moves into the future because he'd built the board. "He's watching us, Leo. He's watching the screen right now." Leo stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keys. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the server. They both looked at the webcam mounted on the monitor. The little green light was off. But in this house, that didn't mean anything. Jordan felt a prickle of sweat down his spine. They were in a digital stalemate, a cage built of their own technology. The violation reached its peak an hour later. Jordan was in the server room, checking the physical connections, when a soft chime echoed from the living room TV. He walked out to find Chloe standing in the center of the room, her face a mask of pure horror. The home security app had overridden the television. The screen wasn't showing the news or a movie. It was a split-screen feed of the house's internal cameras. There was Jordan in the server room, his face etched with exhaustion. And there was Chloe's bedroom, the pink walls and fairy lights looking sickly in the night vision green of the lens. The camera panned slowly, deliberately, focusing on her unmade bed, her vanity, the private corners of her life. "He's inside, Dad," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "He's watching me sleep." Jordan grabbed the remote, mashing the power button, but the screen stayed live. The sanctuary was gone. The walls of their home had become glass, and the predator was on the other side, smiling. Jordan didn't wait for Leo's approval. He grabbed the intruder's dropped phone from the desk, his mind made up. A new GPS coordinate had pinged 20 minutes ago, a dark alleyway behind a tech hub downtown. It was a risk, a blatant lure. But with 4 hours left on the clock, he didn't have the luxury of caution. "Stay here with Leo," Jordan told Chloe, his voice firm, though his heart was a frantic drum in his chest. "Don't leave the house." He didn't tell Leo where he was going. He couldn't risk the kid trying to stop him. He drove through the Spokane streets like a man possessed, the rain-slicked asphalt reflecting the neon signs of diners and gas stations. He pulled into the shadows a block away from the coordinates and stepped out into the cold. The alley was a narrow throat of brick and damp concrete, smelling of old trash and wet soot. He moved slowly, his boots splashing in stagnant puddles, his eyes scanning the rusted fire escapes above. He saw the figure too late. A man stepped out from behind a dumpster, his silhouette broad and menacing. He wasn't the masked intruder from the house. He was bigger, a hired thug with a heavy baton in his hand. "The phone?" the man growled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Give it over and you walk out." Jordan didn't speak. He couldn't. The rage that had been simmering since he saw Sarah's photo finally boiled over. The thug lunged, the baton whistling through the air, catching Jordan across the shoulder with a sickening thud. The pain was white-hot, radiating down his arm, but it only fueled the fire. Jordan swung his heavy leather briefcase, the one filled with student files and the weight of a ruined career, with everything he had. The corner of the case caught the man across the jaw, a wet crack echoing in the narrow space. The thug stumbled, his eyes glazing over for a split second, and Jordan didn't give him a chance to recover. He struck again, and then again, using the briefcase as a shield and a club. He was a man possessed. A counselor who had spent his life teaching conflict resolution, now resolving this with primal, desperate violence. The thug swung the baton again, catching Jordan in the ribs, but Jordan drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, pinning him against the brick wall. He could feel the man's breath, smell the stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. With a final, guttural roar, Jordan shoved the man back and turned, sprinting for his car. He could hear the heavy boots of the thug behind him, but he didn't look back. He dived into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life as he slammed it into reverse. He tore out of the alley, the tires screeching against the wet pavement, his heart hammering against his cracked ribs. He'd survived, but the realization of how far Marcus was willing to go, hiring muscle, seeking blood, chilled him more than the cold rain. When he walked back through his front door, the silence of the house was different. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of an empty tomb. "Chloe," he called out, his voice cracking. There was no answer. He ran to the hallway, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the hardwood. The door to her bedroom was wide open. Her tablet lay on the floor, the screen cracked. He picked it up, and a series of audio files began to play automatically. It was his voice, his own rough, gravelly rasp, but the words were poison. "You're a burden, Chloe," the deep fake voice said. "Your mother died because she couldn't stand being around you. I can't wait for you to just disappear." Jordan felt the air leave the room. It was a perfect imitation, capturing every inflection, every breath. To a girl already drowning in guilt and grief, it was the final anchor. He looked at the vanity, at the empty space where her backpack usually sat. Marcus hadn't just stolen his data. He'd stolen his daughter's faith in the only person she had left. He found her in the hallway, or rather, the ghost of her. He tried to reach out, to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away, as if his hand were a hot iron. Her eyes were vacant, her face a pale mask of betrayal. "I know it's not you," she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. "But I can't hear it anymore. Every time you speak, I hear those things." Jordan felt his heart break in a way he didn't know was possible. "Chloe, it's a machine. It's a trick. You have to believe me." But as he spoke, he realized the futility of the words. The technology had bypassed the brain and gone straight for the soul. She looked at him one last time, a look of profound, hollow sadness. And then she turned and walked into her room, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot. Jordan stood in the hallway, isolated and powerless. A father who had lost the ability to even comfort his own child. The digital war had claimed its most precious casualty. He walked back into the office, his movements slow and heavy. Leo was looking at him, his green eyes filled with a pity that Jordan couldn't stand. "We're out of time, Jordan. 2 hours left." Jordan looked at the monitor, his face hard. The defensive play was over. Marcus had taken everything, his wife's memory, his career, his daughter's trust. "No more firewalls, Leo," Jordan said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rasp. "We're going to give him what he wants. We're going to set a trap." He sat down at the keyboard, his fingers steady despite the pain in his ribs. They were going to use a vulnerable, high-value file as bait. A fake set of confession notes that would appear to confirm Marcus's forgeries. It was a digital siren song, designed to lure the stalker into a live, sustained connection that even Marcus couldn't hide. "If he bites," Leo whispered, "we'll have him. But if he doesn't?" Jordan didn't finish the sentence. He just hit upload. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Jordan went to check on Chloe one last time before the final digital push. But when he pushed the door open, the room was empty. The window was wide open, the sheer white curtains fluttering in the cold Spokane breeze. On her pillow sat a small, crumpled piece of notebook paper. "I can't trust anyone anymore, not even my own ears. I'm sorry, Dad. I just need it to be quiet." Jordan felt a wave of cold terror wash over him, more profound than anything he'd felt in the alley. He'd been so focused on the screen that he'd missed the girl. He ran to the window, looking out into the dark backyard, but there was no sign of her. She was gone, out in a world that had been turned into a nightmare by the man who was supposed to be his brother. He'd failed his wife, and now the cycle was repeating with his daughter. The chime of his phone was like a physical strike. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling. It was an image, high resolution, crystal clear. Chloe was standing on the narrow walkway of the Monroe Street Bridge, her hands gripping the rusted railing, her face a pale blur against the dark rush of the river below. The stalker had sent it. Marcus was there, or someone he'd hired was, watching her, documenting her final moments of despair. The psychological torture had reached its zenith. Marcus wasn't just destroying his life. He was inviting Jordan to watch the funeral. "He's at the bridge," Jordan gasped, his voice failing him. He felt his knees buckle, the weight of the image crushing the air from his lungs. He sank to the floor in the hallway, the cracked tablet still gripped in his hand, his vision blurring. He was a counselor, a man who fixed people, and he couldn't even keep his own daughter from the edge of a bridge. Leo was there in an instant, his hands gripping Jordan's shoulders, shaking him with a violence born of desperation. "Jordan, look at me. Get up." Leo's voice was a sharp command, cutting through the fog of Jordan's panic. "If you fall apart now, she's gone. Do you hear me? We have the connection. We have the bait. This is how we find him, and this is how we save her." Jordan looked up, his hazel eyes bloodshot and raw. He saw the fire in Leo's eyes, the refusal to let the darkness win. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of vanilla and rain-slicked wood grounding him. He stood up, his joints popping, his jaw set in a hard, jagged line. "Trace it," he said, his voice returning to that low, dangerous grind. "Trace every bit of that photo. I want a location, Leo. Now." The paralysis was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical resolve. He would hunt this man to the ends of the earth. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard, his eyes reflecting the cascading lines of data. "I'm in the header of the photo," he muttered. "There's a recurring administrative password in the metadata. It's old, Jordan, a decade old." Jordan leaned over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing at the string of characters. It was a date, their mother's birthday, followed by a sequence of numbers they'd used for their childhood bike locks. It was the final confirmation. Marcus was using the wreckage of their shared history as the foundation for his malice. "That's the back door," Jordan whispered. "He never changed it. He's been using it as his primary key for years." Leo tapped a final key, and a map of a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Spokane bloomed on the screen. A single, pulsing red dot sat over a ranch-style house. "That's the source of the upload. That's where the script is running." Jordan didn't wait for a plan. He grabbed his keys and his heavy coat, his mind a whirlwind of static and steel. "Stay on the line," he told Leo. "If that countdown hits 0, everything Chloe has ever told me in confidence goes public. Don't let it happen." He drove like a man with nothing left to lose, the suburban streets a blur of beige stucco and yellowing lawns. He pulled up to the rental property, a nondescript house that looked like 1,000 others. But the air around it felt heavy, charged with the promise of violence. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the cracked asphalt of the driveway. The house was dark, save for a flickering blue glow from a back window. He approached the front door, his hand reaching for the knob, but it didn't budge. A mechanical hum vibrated through the wood, an electronic lock cycling through codes with a speed that defied manual entry. Marcus had turned the house into a fortress, a digital bunker in the middle of a quiet street. Jordan didn't have time for codes. He moved to the side of the house, his eyes scanning for a weakness. He found a basement window, half hidden by overgrown bushes. He kicked the glass in, the sound of the shattering pane swallowed by the wind, and tumbled into the dark, smelling of damp concrete and old dust. He moved through the house like a shadow, his heart a frantic drum in his chest. He reached the back room, the source of the blue light. The door was ajar, and inside, the walls were lined with monitors, each one displaying a different piece of his life. There was his bank account, his school files, and a live feed of the Monroe Street Bridge. A figure was hunched over the main workstation, his back to the door, his fingers moving with a manic intensity. Jordan didn't hesitate. He lunged, his body a weapon of pure, unadulterated rage. He tackled the figure, the weight of his momentum carrying them both to the floor. They crashed into a nest of cables, the sound of clattering hardware filling the room. Jordan pinned the man down, his hands reaching for the mask, his fingers digging into the synthetic fabric. "You're done, Marcus," he roared, his voice a guttural sound of triumph. He ripped the mask away, ready to see the face of the brother who had betrayed him. But the face beneath wasn't Marcus. It was a young man, barely 20, his eyes wide with a confused, primal terror. "I don't know who Marcus is," the kid yelled, his voice cracking. "I just got paid through the app. They told me to sit here and keep the script running. Please don't kill me." Jordan froze, his hands still gripped around the kid's collar. A decoy. A low-level criminal hired to be the face of a ghost. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been lured away from the real battle. A sharp, mechanical click echoed through the house. The sound of heavy security shutters slamming shut over every window and door. The lights in the room dimmed, replaced by the harsh, red glow of emergency LEDs. Jordan ran to the front door, but a steel plate had slid into place, sealing the exit. He was trapped, a prisoner in a high-tech kill box designed by the man who knew his every move. Every monitor in the room suddenly shifted, the data streams replaced by a single, massive countdown timer. 9:59, 6:58. Below the timer, a header read, "Initiating Scorched Earth Protocol. Target, Chloe Mitchell, Therapy Archives." Jordan felt the floor dissolve beneath him. In 10 minutes, every private thought, every trauma, every secret his daughter had ever shared with him in the safety of his office would be broadcast to every screen in Spokane. It would be the final, irreversible destruction of her social recovery. He ran back to the workstation, pushing the terrified decoy aside. He mashed the keys, trying to find a way into the script, but the firewall was a wall of black glass. "Leo, are you there?" he shouted into his headset. But the signal was dead. The room was a Faraday cage, cut off from the world. He grabbed a heavy metal server rack and swung it against the monitors, the screens exploding in a shower of sparks and glass. But the countdown just moved to the next screen, and the next. The physical destruction was useless. The script was cloud-based, running from a remote server he couldn't touch. He looked at the timer, 07:42, and felt a despair so profound it was like a physical weight in his chest. He was trapped in a room filled with his own failures, watching the clock tick down to the end of his daughter's life. A low, rasping voice suddenly filled the room, coming from the intercom system hidden in the ceiling. "Do you like the view, Jordan?" It was Marcus. Not a deep fake, not a recording, but the real man, his voice dripping with a decade's worth of fermented resentment. "You always had the perfect life, didn't you? The house, the girl, the respect. And what did I get? A gutter and a needle." Jordan stood in the center of the red-lit room, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I tried to help you, Marcus. I sent money, I called." A bitter, jagged laugh echoed through the speakers. "You sent scraps. You never fought for me. You just watched me drown from your ivory tower. Well, now you get to watch Chloe drown. And the best part? You're the one who provided the water." Jordan looked at the timer, 05:15, and realized that the digital battle was over. He couldn't outcode Marcus. He couldn't break the encryption. He was a counselor, not a hacker. He had to change the game. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of ozone and desperation filling his lungs. He didn't look at the keyboard. He looked at the camera mounted above the main monitor. "You're right, Marcus," Jordan said, his voice dropping into that low, deliberate grind he used in his most difficult sessions. "I did fail you. I was so busy trying to be the perfect man that I forgot how to be a brother." He leaned in, his face filling the frame. "But you're not doing this for revenge. You're doing this because you're lonely. You're doing this because you want me to see you. Well, I'm looking at you now, and I see a man who's so terrified of being forgotten that he'd rather be a monster." He saw the timer flicker. 04, 02. And then pause for a fraction of a second. He'd hit a nerve. He continued, his voice soft, almost gentle, feeding Marcus's massive, wounded ego. "You're a genius, Marcus. This setup, the mirroring, the deep fakes, it's brilliant. No one else could have done this." He could practically feel Marcus leaning in on the other side of the connection, intoxicated by the validation he'd been craving for a lifetime. "Tell me how you did it," Jordan whispered. "Tell me how you bypassed the district's Tier 4 firewall. I want to know how the best hacker I've ever seen took me down." The timer stayed paused at 03:45. Marcus's voice returned, no longer mocking, but filled with a manic, boastful energy. He began to explain the architecture of the hack, the subtle vulnerabilities he'd exploited, the beauty of the code. Jordan remained submissive, a captive audience to his brother's narcissism, while his eyes scanned the room for a physical bypass. Behind the main server rack, he saw it, a manual override lever, rusted and half-hidden by a bundle of cables. It was a physical failsafe, a remnant of the building's old industrial life. He moved slowly, keeping his face toward the camera, his voice a steady stream of praise for Marcus's brilliance. "And the van?" Jordan asked, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the lever. "How did you keep the latency so low while moving?" Marcus laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. "I wasn't moving, you idiot. I've been parked right outside your house the whole time, using your own Wi-Fi as a relay. The ultimate irony, right?" Jordan felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp, it was like an electric shock. He'd found him. Marcus wasn't in some remote basement. He was a shadow on his own doorstep. With a final, guttural roar, Jordan threw his weight against the lever. The metal groaned, a sound of grinding gears and protesting steel, and then the security shutters began to rise with a slow, agonizing crawl. Jordan didn't wait for them to fully open. He dived through the gap, the cold Spokane air hitting him like a physical blow. He scrambled to his feet and ran for his car, the engine roaring to life before he'd even closed the door. He drove back to his neighborhood like a man possessed, the streets a blur of gray and neon. He pulled onto his street, and there it was. A nondescript white van parked under a flickering street lamp, just 3 houses down from his own. A thin trail of smoke curled from the driver's side window, and the interior was bathed in the blue glow of multiple laptop screens. Jordan didn't slow down. He rammed his car into the back of the van, the sound of the collision echoing through the quiet neighborhood like a thunderclap. He jumped out, his hand reaching for a heavy tire iron he'd grabbed from the trunk. He ripped the van door open, the scent of stale coffee and old electronics hitting him. Marcus was there, hunched over a laptop, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and primal fury. "It's over, Marcus," Jordan roared, his voice a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. He didn't swing the iron. Instead, he pulled out his phone and hit the live stream button, pointing the camera directly at Marcus's face. "Look at him," Jordan shouted to the community forum, his voice echoing in the rain. "This is the man who's been destroying your lives. This is the ghost in the machine." The community forum, which had been a weapon of Marcus's malice, suddenly turned. The comments shifted from mockery to outrage as the participants saw the pathetic, shivering man behind the curtain. The anonymity that had been Marcus's greatest strength was stripped away, leaving him exposed and powerless. The police sirens began to wail in the distance, a sound of approaching justice. Marcus looked at the screen, at the thousands of people now calling for his arrest, and he seemed to deflate, the rage leaving him like air from a punctured tire. He was no longer a genius. He was just a broken man in a van. The police arrived in a flurry of blue and red lights, dragging Marcus from the vehicle as the stolen data was suppressed by the cyber crimes unit. The perfect hack had been undone by a simple, analog truth. The sun was beginning to rise over Spokane, casting a pale, watery light over the neighborhood. Jordan sat on his front porch, his arm around Chloe, who had been found by Leo near the bridge, safe but shaken. The screens were off. The house was quiet. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. "It's going to take time," Jordan said, his voice a low, steady rasp. "But we're going to rebuild. No more secrets. No more digital walls." Chloe leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand gripping his frayed navy sweater. They were two people left standing in the wreckage of a digital war. But as they watched the light grow stronger, they realized they were finally free. The noise of the internet had faded, replaced by the simple, unbreakable rhythm of the physical world. They were home,